Hi, I'm Tom Daley and welcome to the Lexington Writers Club. As a teacher at Lexington Community Education, it's been my pleasure to help Lexingtonians achieve their dream of bringing their thoughts and experiences to life on the page. On this show, we'll be interviewing some of those writers and we'll find out what it's like to get to be a writer. What are the pitfalls? What are the joys? And maybe in the process, you'll be inspired to write yourselves. So welcome to the show. Today, I am going to be interviewing two authors who have both published their own books, memoirs about both of them, about their mother. They are both Lexington residents, and they were actually friends long before they came into the workshop. Mimi Aarens and Pam Moriarty.
Hi.
Mimi's book is Mah and Me, Brooklyn Memories, and Pam's book is What Happened to My Mother. Okay? So first of all, let's just tell a little bit about myself. So I am actually a poet. I started leading the Lexington Community Education Poetry Writing Workshop, and they asked me to take on the Memoir Writing Workshop, and I have been doing that since 2006. And both Pam and Mimi found their way into my workshop, independent of each other. But interestingly, I was doing a poetry reading in Concord at the Emerson Umbrella, and both of them were in the audience. They were old friends who'd sort of grown apart from each other, fallen away from each other. And Mimi came up to me and said, "Is that Pam Moriarty?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And they hooked up later on. I don't think they actually met that day, but so they've renewed their friendship, and they've also been collaborating on reading their launch. They did a book launch together at the Depot in Lexington, and they also have been doing other readings, and now the Lexington Writers Club through the gracious auspices of LexMedia. So first of all, I want to talk to both of you about what got you motivated to write your books. So Mimi, let's start with you. Why did you write Mah and Me?
Well, after several years of writing anecdotal pieces, vignettes about growing up in Brooklyn, particularly on Ashford Street in Brooklyn, it seemed to me that so many of the pieces that I had written involved the relationship that I had with my mom as a child growing up until I went off to college. And so I began to think that there might be a focus to this, and that perhaps there's a book here. And so that's when I went and I had my famous conversation with you at Panera's and asking you, do you think there's a book here? And you were very encouraging. So then I just went ahead with that orientation in mind and excluded pieces that were really very far removed from my relationship with my mom, or under her parenting, under her parentage.
Right, so they say that the difference between memoir and autobiography is autobiography, if your life is a globe, is a planet, autobiography is the whole globe, and memoir is a slice of that planet. So the slice that you chose to cut is of your relationship with your mother. Pam, how did you what motivated you to start writing your book?
I sort of started the same way as Mimi. I sort of started, because I grew up in Ireland. I'm an immigrant here and came in 1959. But I had a whole life, a childhood in Ireland, and also part of it spent in England during the Blitz. And I wanted to write some anecdotes or short stories for my kids. And I had granddaughters at that time. So that's what got me started on snippets. They were only snippets, they were anecdotes. And then I joined, like Mimi, I joined your classes mainly because I didn't like writing by myself. I thought it would be so helpful to know that once a week I had to bring something in and have other people read it. And as these pieces began to accumulate, it was like, what am I going to do with them? And I couldn't think that a book of short stories about me, who nobody ever heard of, would have any interest for anybody. But I also noticed that the most well-received in your classes of my stories had to do with my relationship with my mother, who disappeared from my life when I was 7. And so I spent all of that time, those decades, missing her, wondering what had happened to her, and of course eventually going on the journey that would tell me what happened to her. And once I had her in the forefront of my mind, it was easy, and you helped me a lot in organizing this thing. I wanted to structure it so it read like a novel.
Okay.
And
So you make an interesting point that nobody would be interested in you, in your stories, but actually there's something, the phenomenon called the nobody memoir. I mean, a lot of people are interested in celebrity memoirs, right? But one of the most successful memoir writers is Mary Carr, who nobody knew from Eve. And she wrote The Liars Club, which is about her relationship with her father. And then she wrote Lit and Cherry. And she also wrote a wonderful book called The Art of Memoir. So both of you have written nobody memoirs. But one thing that happens to an interestingly written memoir is it makes you a somebody. And here you are on television.
wow.
Yeah. Now, interesting that you both were born the same year, and how many days apart?
7.
7 days apart, same year, we won't say which year, and you both went through World War II, very different experiences. Mimi in Brooklyn, which was, there were curfews. Do you remember curfews and
yes,
blackouts?
And blackouts.
Right? Pam, on the other hand, was living in Birmingham, around the outskirts of Birmingham, and suffering bombing raids. Her mother was an ambulance driver. After she'd huddle with Pam in the shelter, she'd go off and pick up, the dead and wounded from all over the town, right? All right, so let's get to the stories. Let's get to the story, and we'll go on this with Mimi. So there's some wonderful stories in your book. The ones that come to my mind are meeting boys, going there's a really great story about you're wearing a Roosevelt button, and some, nasty kid, anti-Semite kid, rips it off you, stamps on it and says, dirty little Jew, stamps on Roosevelt and says, Jew lover, and you go home, and then your father says something nasty about the Polish people, and then you talk about the fact that you were trying to play with a black kid, and your father wouldn't let you do that. So give me a story that you want to, maybe you could read a little bit from one of your stories.
Well, yes, you have a fantastic memory. The vignettes that are in this book are about just moments in my life, for the most part, and the one you refer to about playing with the Afro-American children and so forth. I'd like to read a little bit about how our family prepared for Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement at the time of the Jewish New Year, and how we celebrated it. And I called it Once Upon a Yom Kippur in Brooklyn. Ma wears her new hat, a black patent leather stovepipe with a brim of red plaid taffeta. The hat is perched on her head of wavy black hair. A short, wispy veil reaches down over her Hedy Lamarr eyebrows. Mimi, don't forget your gloves. And Edna, my older sister. Make sure you have at least 2 handkerchiefs for that cold of yours. My gloves are shorties, black kidskin with a small white button at the wrist. They're my dressy gloves. And I'm wearing them with my new sweater and matching gray striped suit, all birthday presents. Edna, who's 6 years older than I am, is in a new brown coat and her special pigskin gloves. We're all dressed up because it's Yom Kippur, and on our high holy days, we're in our autumn costumes like our Christian neighbors on Easter Sunday in their spring finery. We fast today. Daddy says, Yom Kippur means the Day of Atonement. The holiday is all about sinning and forgiveness. But I'm confused about why I have to fast. I don't think I've sinned. And anyway, no one tells me what sinning means. Fasting is an important religious ritual, he says. Jewish people all over the world observe this day. I don't resist too strenuously. All my friends and their families do this as well. And besides, it's clear to me that I have no choice.
Nice. All right, so let's talk about some of the devices that you're using here, because I think this would be instructive for anybody who's thinking about writing. You start with a very vivid description. You're giving us the parameters, what the material is of your mother's hat, right? Now, technically speaking, if there's a plot in this story, what somebody's hat looks like is irrelevant, right? But writing is not just about plot. Writing is about atmospherics, and you've created a wonderful atmosphere by giving details that we can see, images that we can conjure in our minds of the hat, of what your sister Edna is wearing, what your mother is, where she's standing. Then you also give us some, it's not actually back and forth dialogue, but it's dialogue in the sense that your father is saying things to you. You're kind of paraphrasing your own thoughts in response to what he says. So we've got 2 elements here that aren't exactly leading us along a plot line, but they're giving us a wonderful picture, an image of how people are in the world. And that's really 80% of any kind of writing. So wonderful. That's a wonderful story.
Thanks, Tom.
Now, what was it like to write that? How did you come up with that? Did you have to, was that a memory that you had clearly in your head, or did you have to conjure it? Or
I think I was remembering my mother's hat.
Oh,
And
okay.
I can't tell you why I was remembering her hat, but it was a very particular hat. And she looked a very special way in that hat with that little black veil over her forehead. And as a little kid, she was beautiful and marvelous and my universe to me. Mm-hmm. And so that image of my mom and Edna and I following behind her is a very potent one. And then the circumstances of celebrating the holiday together and what went on in the synagogue and so forth. But those aspects of my mom have really stayed with me and helped me to look back into her as my mom and my relationship with her, and those connections are still very potent.
Good. Okay. So Pam, I'm going to take a little bit different tack and talk about something that I remember when you first started talking about your relationship with your mother in the workshop, which is that you were taking a class at a community college, maybe, in psychology, and you were in a parking lot, and you got to talking to one of your classmates who was much younger than you, and she started asking you about your family, and she said something about a mother, and you said, "I don't have a mother." Remember that?
I do.
Did that find its way into the book, that episode?
No, because
No.
that came later
Yeah.
after this.
Right, but it was
didn't,
kind of
yeah.
that confrontation with her was what. Well, explain what happened after you had that confrontation.
It came when I was a young adult, and well, I was an adult mother, and I was taking classes, and it just came out of the blue. I was not thinking of my mother in particular at that time, and this young woman asked me. She said, "You never talk about your mother. where's your mother? And I said, I don't, and I was like instinctive. I said, I don't have a mother. And that really jogged loose a lot of old pain and questioning and queries, because I had always told myself, you are a child who doesn't have a mother. That was how I sort of dealt with it.
How did you explain that to your children if they asked you about your mother? Did they ever ask you that?
Yeah, they must have done. I can't recall explicitly. They must have asked about their mother or their grandmother, and I said, she's not here.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that became a stimulus for an extraordinary process of discovery in which you did some research. You finally got a hold of your mother's sisters. You found out they were still alive. You learned an awful lot about your mother, and it also opened up your, I don't know if they were really repressed, but opened up memories that had been sealed off about the whole experience of the bombing raids in Birmingham when your mother, I just reread this morning that little piece where there's been this horrible bombing raid. You're at a neighbor's house. The neighbor, your mother says, I don't want to, if this is the end, I want to be home, because they're talking about an invasion. She says, if there's an invasion, I want to go home. So and the neighbor says, well, make sure you take your gas mask. So the two of you go and sit in the kitchen, and bombs are falling, and a bomb so near that something from the shelf on the kitchen crashes to the floor, and the two of you are just sitting there. I mean, your house could be hit at any minute. And finally she says, I have had enough of this, right? You both put on your gas masks and you go into the little bomb shelter in the backyard. But that's when she decides to send you to a boarding school in Dublin, which she does, and that's the last you see of her. Okay? It's an extraordinary moment in there. Do you remember writing that? Do you remember how you put that together?
And in terms of writing a memoir, what I found when I was starting to recover some of these moments, particularly the ones where my mother was actually there, is that some of them came out whole. There was the scene, there was me, there was my mother, there was what happened. And you just wrote it down. But there were other scenes where I would catch kind of glimpses of what was happening and glimpses of how I was being and how my mother was being. And those I kind of, in the context of everything else, I kind of filled in.
Okay. So Mimi, we're talking about process and how you come to something. I remember when you would go up to upstate New York for summer vacations. There was a place that you went to every year.
The Borscht Belt.
The Borscht Belt, but there was a I don't know whether it was a lodge or a motel or a boarding house, and Mrs. K was the name of the proprietor, or was that what she called your mother?
Mrs. K was my mother.
Was your mother? What was her name? Do you remember?
Mrs. G.
Mrs. G. Okay. So there's a scene where you come back. It's the second or third or maybe fourth time you've been to this particular place. You come back in the summer. She comes to greet you all, Mrs. G, the proprietor. She comes to greet you. You and your father and mother and sister are in the car. And there are these two handsome guys, one of whom is the son of Mrs. G, who you hadn't ever thought very much, but you thought to yourself, whoa, he's grown up. He's gotten quite big. And he had a friend whose name was
Tony,
who plays quite a role later on in the romance. And so there's this wonderful scene where Tony comes over to introduce himself and shake your father's hand and say hello, and the two of you exchange a little glance. Do you remember that?
I remember it.
Okay, now
my heart is fluttering while you're reciting that.
Now I want to know, how did you come up with that? Was that a memory that was intact, that you had sort of browsed over the years, or did you have to kind of summon that back when you were putting the book together?
Well, I did write several pieces, separate pieces, about going on vacation during the summer with my mom to a bungalow colony. That's what those places were called. And we had a little cottage just, with a couple of beds and a table and a stove. And it was certainly sufficient for us. And we went to several different places over the course of 10 or 12 years. But going back to the Goldmans, that was Mrs. G. Tony was I don't want to say repressed. He was just in some pigeonhole of my memory for many, many years. And during one of the writings that I did of going to the same area during the summer, I started to think about Tony. And then it was a flood of memory and sweet memory, and as only a 14 or 15-year-old can experience the kind of feelings that I had. And it just flooded out. And then the details of it, though, I had to, as Pam relayed her looking for the details, I started to remember about the lakefront and the friend, a girlfriend who used to come up to the same area during the summer, and how we all flocked around together in the lake. And then one thing led to the other, and I thought about looking up at a very starry sky, which, of course, in those years, one could see a very starry sky, and my experiences with Tony. And that's perhaps one of the longest pieces in my book. And it is sweet and touching and has brought back other memories to me as well.
Yeah, so that's really an important thing for people who are, considering writing their memoirs, is that the process of writing memoir is a process in which you are going to be stimulated. Memories that you didn't have, that you haven't brought back, are going to suddenly reappear. So a novelist named Reynolds Price, who once did self-hypnosis, and he said he in the process of hypnotizing himself, he opened up door after door of memory from his childhood. But that's exactly what you guys have done without having to worry about hypnosis. You didn't have to teach yourself hypnosis. Just starting to write, starting to think, starting to remember is a stimulant that brings back so many amazing things. And both of you have enriched my life and the life of anybody who's read your book with those marvelous things that you've returned to. Now, Pam, I want to talk about once you left England and you came to Ireland, you were in this all-girls boarding school, and during Christmas break and vacations, you would go live with your grandmother. So describe your grandmother to us.
What I remember about my grandmother was the color beige. So my grandmother, as I remember her from my childhood, as a beige complexion. She had beige eyes. She had beige hair. And I remember as a child using that. I loved that word beige as a child. I thought it was a wonderful word for a color. And that's how I remember my grandmother. She was also not a happy woman.
To say the least.
Yeah, so she really did not take kindly to having been stuck with a moody 7-year-old who wanted her mother.
Yeah. And she also had a alcoholic husband, right?
Interestingly enough, my grandfather is one of the few adults in my life who I truly loved and who I truly felt loved me. He was a raging alcoholic. Yeah, he came home drunk every single night, and they fought like cats and dogs. But he always smiled. He's one of the few adults I remember who smiled when he saw me. And he would sing little songs to me that would make my grandmother crazy because she knew he was, Yeah, that's what I remember about my grandfather. Yes, she did not have a happy life, my grandmother.
Yeah. But interestingly, when she was sick and dying, there's a scene in your book where you get a phone call from, or you get a message or a phone call from somebody saying that your grandmother's in the hospital and is in a coma, and you call your husband. You have a deal with your husband which says you're never to call unless it's an emergency. So as soon as he picks up the phone, he goes, "What happened?
Yeah.
What happened?" And so you explain to him, and he says, I thought this was so sweet, he says, your grandmother was a crusty old woman who was not very kind to you, but she's your grandmother. She had a stroke. You have to go and be with her. And this is when you had 3 small children that you were taking care of. He said, I'll take care of, and there was a woman visiting you at the time.
His mother.
His mother. That's right, it was his mother. We'll take care, and you went off to Ireland, and then you had all these plans to sort of like, once your grandmother came to, you were going to talk to her and sing to her and reminisce with her. You go home, you're staying with some friends, and your friend wakes you up and tells you that she's died in her sleep. How did you feel when that happened?
I really was sad because I had used the week before while she was in the hospital. She had really softened my heart towards her because had been like this with her for a long time, and I had. You're right. I would think about, okay, when she gets out of here, I'm going to take her to Bray. Bray's a seaside town just outside Dublin that she loved, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and I'm going to make a big fuss over her. And I just really felt so happy about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then my friend came and said, it's all over.
Yeah. So one of the wonderful things about both these books is they're not completely time limited. Pam's in particular goes from when she was a girl to a young mother, and Mimi's goes through about 6 or 7 years of relationships with Ma.
Through college.
Through college, yeah. So it's about 10 years, right? Maybe a little longer than that. Starting, when's the first episode? How old are you in the first
3.
episode? Oh, okay,
3
so
or 4.
So it's almost 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So one of the things that I think one of the things that people have a problem with in memoir writing is the parameters. How much do I write? How much do I say? What do I have to exclude? What do I include? And both of you, it seems to me, made very judicious choices about things. And for Mimi's book is, unlike Pam's, which is kind of a linear progression, Mimi's book is vignettes. They are sort of chronologically arranged, right?
Yes, they are.
So one of the ones that I remember most wonderfully is when you were staying on the edge of a lake. This would not have been at the bungalow. This would have been a different place, I think, right?
It was not Mrs. G's
Mrs.
place.
G. It was somebody else's. You decide that there's a party on a boat, and your mother says to you, you can't go on this boat because you can't swim. So you decide, without telling anybody, that you're going to teach yourself to swim. So every morning you get up and you go down and you get in the water and you first just float and then gradually. Do you remember? That part? Yeah.
I do. When I was remembering that incident about the party on the boat and how I had to learn how to swim, I actually had to go through in my head how it was, motion by motion, to become buoyant. And it was a very cerebral exercise to go through what is a very physical, a very sensual kind of an experience of lying on, the sand in a lake, and how little by little I lifted my head and I lifted my hands until I actually had some buoyancy. And of course I didn't think of those things while I was doing them back then when I was 13. All I was thinking about was getting on that boat But the process of writing about learning to swim was a very cerebral kind of exercise for me. And I had to do it. I had to sort of remember for myself the steps my body went through, my body and my mind went through to lift myself up on the water.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about imagination and actually making things up in memoir, because, memoir is supposed to be true, right? Or someone once asked David Sedaris, the famous humorist and memoirist, are your stories true? And he said, true enough, right? He probably has made up a lot of them, but so the question for you guys, both of you, is, and we'll start with Pam, of course you can't remember exactly any dialogue, right? Unless you had a tape recorder with you, which would be unlikely for a 7-year-old kid in Ireland during the war.
In the 40s.
How do you go about recreating dialogue? Because that's what you're doing. How does that happen for you?
Well, when I'm writing back there, where I was back there, I found I was actually back there. There's like this, the part of me inside actually went back there. And while, as I said, some of the pieces that I wrote presented themselves as a whole thing. I saw everything, and other pieces didn't. And the pieces that didn't, I was back there enough that I could, I think, truthfully, and I do acknowledge that here in the book, that some of the pieces came full-blown, and some I really had to kind of fill it in from what I was experiencing back then. It was the going back as I was writing that did that for me, gave me that gift that I could, and I acknowledge that not all the book, it's not verbatim. Who can remember a conversation when you're 6 years old? But you can, when you're back there living that, you can kind of get a feel.
Right, so I think what both of you had just said about the cerebral process of remembering how to learn how to swim, and you're kind of hurling yourself back into time and essentially stepping back into that place, and the extent that it was still there as a memory, is a really important lesson for people who want to write. The most important thing to say to anybody who wants to write is write. So because you were writing, you accessed those marvelous things. Perhaps if you'd just been sitting there trying to conjure it up, it might not have come, or it might not have come with the same kind of force or pressure. But both of you have retrieved wonderful and very important dramatic moments in your lives that you had set aside.
It's exactly as you just said that. You said, that the writing of a memoir itself brings out memories that you may not have even know were there, and that was certainly true for me.
Yeah.
As I wrote, things would pop up that, oh gosh, I remember that, and I hadn't thought about it in donkey's years.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that Mary Carr talks about in her wonderful book, The Art of Memoir, is you have to write about the hardest thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing that you really, and she says do it first. But what's the hardest thing that you had to write about in your memoir about your mother? What was the most sort of painful memory, the most difficult thing to confront?
When I write about my mom sitting at the kitchen table by herself, doing her crossword puzzles, and her place in the kitchen, and that was her domain, and that was her solitude, and that's how I saw my mom growing up. And in fact, one of the vignettes that I write, I call it My Afternoon Mom. And my mom's place in the kitchen and what that room looked like what the room around her looked like. To this day, it's very emotional for me to remember my mom like that, and it sort of personified the parameters of her life.
Okay. All right, Pam, what was the most painful thing for you to write about?
The most difficult thing for me to write about was the moment in that boarding school when I looked up from, I'm on a swing, if you remember.
Yep.
My mother has just brought me to supposedly play with some nice girls for the afternoon. And I look up and she's not there. And it takes about 3 hours for me to understand she wasn't coming for me.
Okay.
And that, I found that very difficult to write about without crying buckets.
Yeah. That's a very moving scene, as I remember. All right, well, we probably should wrap this up, but let me just, to finish up here, let's just talk briefly about the workshop experience for both of you, because you both have been in workshops with me over the years. Pam is still working with me in a workshop. What was useful about the workshop experience, and what wasn't useful about the workshop
I
experience?
cannot think of anything that was not useful, Tom. What was extraordinary for me was to observe the discipline that you encouraged on the group in the group, and not just you weren't slapping anybody's hands. It was the discipline of how we expressed ourselves about each other's work, and also the format of your workshops were very instructive for me, and I certainly have tried to use that structure, the same type of structure, in workshops that I have given at lifelong learning centers for quite a number of years.
Where was that? You were at
Most recently at Regis,
Regis College, right.
for several years, and before that, Boston College, and a year at the Tufts Center as well. And so for me, the discipline of learning how to critique in the group was really the most important thing, and how you created a format for us to be able to do that fairly, and to be cognizant of the words that we were using for to express our feelings about other people's writing.
But, okay,
And-
let me interrupt you and ask you, but how was it helpful to you in your writing? How did it shape or not shape? How did it direct or not direct your writing?
The word that comes to me is succinct.
Succinct, okay.
Yes,
So you
and
learned to cut away
To
excess
cut away
verbiage.
and cut away and cut away until really coming to the kernel of my feeling, or an image, or a conversation, just to be as succinct as possible.
Yeah, so that's an important lesson, because I think most writers, everybody who has any kind of story to tell, and almost everybody, there's nobody who doesn't have a story to tell. They want to tell them and tell them and tell them, and they want to tell every aspect of it, and what Uncle Si did, and what Aunt Mabel did, and sometimes it's hard for a writer to get to focus on the, as you say, the kernel, the essence of what, and to do it succinctly. So that's one thing that I think the workshop as a group experience, it's not just the leader, it's everybody, and you're getting different kinds of feedback from everybody. You're getting different kinds of input. And the best thing you can do from that is just think, well, how does this serve my purposes? How do these impressions that people have inform what I have to do to make this a better or more accessible piece?
Mm-hmm.
So Pam, how was the workshop helpful to you in your writing, in your writing?
Well, I think one of the most powerful things for me in your classes has been listening to you. I had no idea how to look at a piece of writing and even make any determination about it. And listening to you week after week giving your critique and your mantra, speak to the piece, not the author, really caused this major shift in my head about how I looked at what I was writing. And also, I had some very bad habits that you cured me of, like run-on sentences. I used heavy-handed metaphors, thinking I was being so literary. And what you call purple prose.
What is purple prose?
Purple prose is for me, it was, I would think I had created this wonderful literary phrase that I would just drop in there. And every time, and now, of course, if I do it, I know he's going to hate that. And I'm always right.
I don't hate it.
No, I know, but you know what I mean.
The thing is, you're a wonderful storyteller. You also have a poetic sensibility. Sometimes storytelling and poetic sensibility doesn't always match. You know, Faulkner gets away with it, Toni Morrison gets away with it, but sometimes it's better to just tell the story. And I knew you had a poetic, I said, you got the poetic impulse, stay with the storytelling impulse.
And that was probably also the very valuable thing. What Mimi was saying is I learned to just I have a sign by my computer that says, just tell the damn story. Mm-hmm. So forget all the literary devices and all of that nonsense and just simply and straightforwardly tell the story.
Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to turn everybody into a Hemingway, but, you know, there is, for people who are finding their way in writing, it's better to be simpler than more complicated. Yeah. Once you've developed the skill of being a storyteller, once you've figured out how to create nuanced situations and dialogue and, you know, give body language and gestures, which are really important, then you can be a little bit more expansive in terms of your, you know, the prose, the literary work you're doing. But it is really important to learn the skill of succinctness. All right, well, I think we better wrap this up.
Okay.
So thank you both for, both of these books are available on Amazon. What Happened to My Mother is available as both Kindle and print edition, as is...
No, just print.
Okay, Mah and Me is available just in print. They're beautifully designed, beautiful. I think they had the same designer.
Yes. Right? Mimi's daughter, Julie, did my cover.
Julie Weinstein.
Julie Weinstein did these. They're beautiful books.
Did.
And I hope that after having listened to these wonderful authors talk about them, you will purchase your own copies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.